Moscow, 1982. Midnight. Deep beneath a nondescript military facility near Kaluga. Inside a steel-paneled radar command center. Dozens of Soviet officers sat in silence until the room exploded in red. The alarm was unmistakable ICBM launch detected, but this time, not one or two. The radar system showed over 200 warheads incoming from multiple sites in North America, in a pattern that matched a full-scale first strike. On the consoles, tracking vectors lit up like stars. The data screamed only one thing. The United States has launched. Protocol engaged instantly. Phones lit up. Nuclear force commanders scrambled from their bunks. Orders began cascading toward nuclear readiness level 2. Launch keys were prepped. Submarine crews received standby commands. Bombers were powered. The Soviet Union was just minutes away from the most catastrophic decision in history: retaliation against a phantom apocalypse. But then, nothing happened. 5 minutes passed. 10. The missiles never arrived. American radars showed no launches. Western media remained silent. No shockwaves, no detonations, no war. The screen was wrong. A phantom storm. A radar illusion. It wasn't the last time. In fact, over a span of 10 years. Soviet early warning radars would register dozens of such false alarms, some marking hundreds of inbound warheads, all without cause. No software glitch, no foreign spoofing, no CIA interference, just a design flaw. One that neither engineers nor generals could explain because they refused to believe their radar could lie. And so, within the most paranoid nuclear empire on Earth, a terrifying reality set in. The missiles were never there. But the order to launch almost was. In the Soviet military doctrine of the 1980s, radar wasn't just a sensor, it was scripture. The sprawling radar network, ranging from long-range P-14 tall King arrays to over-the-horizon systems like Duga-3, formed the backbone of the USSR's early warning capability. And within that doctrine was a dangerous assumption. If radar sees it, it's real. This was not just belief. It was policy. From deep bunkers outside Moscow to Far Eastern tracking posts, Soviet officers were trained to trust the blip, to follow the arc, to act without doubt, because time was the enemy. Once a missile broke the horizon, the clock started ticking. Flight time from U.S. launch silos to Soviet targets was less than 30 minutes. From submarine-launched Tridents in the Arctic, even faster. The logic followed missile appears, retaliation now, but this rigid certainty created a fatal vulnerability. What if the blip wasn't real? What if the radar echoed something else? What if noise, solar interference, or atmospheric bounce mimicked the path of a warhead? The Soviet system wasn't built to ask those questions, unlike its American counterpart, which used layered confirmation protocols, DSP satellites, radar triangulation, seismic sensors. The Soviet architecture relied heavily on single-source data. A blip could mean death. And with the USSR's launch on warning doctrine, even a single radar alert could escalate to nuclear readiness in minutes. Inside those radar rooms, officers didn't debate signals. They followed procedures. And those procedures were designed for speed, not skepticism. The assumption was total. The Americans wouldn't risk a false launch. So any radar signature matching a ballistic missile must be real. It was the perfect system. Until it wasn't. Because the system couldn't tell the difference between a real missile and a reflection bouncing off the ionosphere. It couldn't distinguish between a Trident SLBM and a flock of high-altitude geese under rare atmospheric conditions. It couldn't separate enemy action from its own internal distortion loops, and no one wanted to admit it. In a command culture where doubt was weakness, questioning the radar meant questioning the state. And so, the rooms stayed silent. The red lights kept blinking. And Soviet missile crews stood by waiting to launch at a threat that didn't exist. At the heart of Soviet nuclear posture was a doctrine as brutal as it was simple. Launch on warning. It meant that if early warning systems, particularly radar, detected a U.S. missile launch, the Soviet response would be immediate, not retaliatory after impact, but preemptively reactive, based on warning alone. This policy wasn't a bluff. It was a reflection of deep strategic fear. By the late 1970s, Soviet planners believed they were dangerously behind in missile accuracy and anti-submarine warfare. American Minuteman III and Poseidon missiles were fast, stealthy, and backed by real-time intelligence. Worse, U.S. ballistic missile submarines could strike with such short notice that by the time Soviet leadership confirmed an attack, they might already be dead. To counter this, the USSR created an infrastructure that could absorb a first strike in real time, but only by acting faster than the missiles themselves. The result, a doctrine built on infallibility of sensors, radars like the Daryl-U, the Don-2N, and dozens of mobile and fixed-position systems were tasked with watching the skies night and day. Each was hardwired into the chain of command, forming a lattice of instant reaction triggers. If radar detected an inbound strike and confirmed a pattern consistent with an American launch arcing trajectories, velocity, spacing, origin coordinates, the system would begin ticking toward retaliation. The final authority always rested with Soviet leadership. But the system was stacked with pressures to escalate. There were no incentives to doubt, no fail-safes encouraging delay, and worst of all, no training for misreadings. This was by design. Soviet command feared hesitation more than error. The idea of better safe than sorry didn't exist. If they hesitated during a real American strike, Moscow could be ash by the time doubts were resolved. So they trained officers to trust radar as truth incarnate. Every reflection, every echo, every trajectory was drilled into response timelines. Seconds mattered more than accuracy. But as radar technology advanced, so did its complexity. And complexity, in a closed system with no external verification, meant new forms of error. Atmospheric distortion, solar flares, layered returns from polar ice caps, false echoes from weather balloons, ground-based spoofing by their own jamming equipment. These weren't hypothetical, they were happening. And the radar doctrine, once considered the shield of the Soviet homeland, was becoming something else. A hair-trigger mirror, pointing back at itself. One that could, with a single phantom signal, activate the end of civilization. The doctrine was no longer a deterrent. It had become a trap. October 1983, a routine overnight shift at the Komsomolsk radar station near the Soviet Far East. The operator, Lieutenant Sergei Novikov, had seen hundreds of scans in his career bears mistaken for low-flying aircraft. Solar flares, scrambling transponders, but nothing like this. At exactly 03:17 local time, the main console burst into a torrent of activity. Dozens of missile-like returns. Origin the North Pacific. Trajectory-perfect arcs rising from the ocean, descending across the Kamchatka Peninsula. Velocity consistent with SLBM-class weapons. Submarine-launched ballistic missiles, 43 of them. The room froze. Sergei's second-in-command reached for the secure line. Protocol dictated that any simultaneous multi-missile detection required immediate alert escalation to strategic rocket forces. Within minutes, command centers across eastern Russia were waking up. Crews rushed to bomber hangars. Submarines were ordered to prepare cruise missile tubes. Nuclear forces were pushed to alert posture, all based on one signal. But something felt wrong. The radar return showed all 43 warheads traveling in the exact same pattern, altitudes and angles nearly identical. No deviation, no variation. Too perfect. Novikov stared at the screen. SLBM launches were staggered. They came from multiple tubes. Even the Americans couldn't synchronize trajectories this precisely. He hesitated. Rather than transmit launch coordinates, he requested a secondary sweep from the Olenogorsk site, 500 kilometers west. Nothing. No missiles, no echoes, no infrared, no sonic booms. Then a reply came in from Vladivostok. Civilian satellites in the region had detected a weather anomaly, a rare high-altitude inversion over the Pacific. Reflected radar waves had bounced off the upper stratosphere, hitting cold air masses and returning as false targets. The radar had fooled itself. The missiles weren't launches. They were ghost signals, created by an extremely rare atmospheric lensing event. But in those 9 minutes, the Soviet system had come within a keystroke of issuing a retaliatory strike on the U.S. Pacific Fleet. If Novikov had acted by the book, those warheads would have flown. And not because of provocation. Because water vapor in the upper atmosphere bent a microwave beam the wrong way. No official record of the event was ever released. Novikov was rotated out of the command post weeks later. No medals, no questions, no discussions. But among radar operators in the Far East, a new phrase entered their whispered lexicon: don't trust the perfect arcs. The after-action report from Komsomolsk was hand-delivered to the General Staff. The verdict: atmospheric lensing, false positives, phantom warheads. But the Kremlin wasn't interested in the explanation. They were interested in who had authorized the delay and escalation. Lieutenant Novikov's hesitation had prevented a nuclear response. And in Moscow's view, that wasn't heroism, it was insubordination. The Politburo's mindset was clear: the system must be trusted. False positives were a Western myth. Mistakes were not structural, they were operational. The Komsomolsk radar station was ordered into full diagnostic recalibration. The weather anomaly explanation was redacted from internal briefings. The official line system operating within expected parameters. No senior official wanted to admit that the Soviet radar network, marketed for decades as flawless, could be tricked by natural physics. More damning still, the radar signal had been clean. No static, no flicker, just wrong. This terrified the generals. If false launches could look this perfect, the foundation of deterrence was compromised. But public doubt was not an option. Internally, they buried the report. No investigation into high-altitude reflection phenomena. No revisions to software filtering protocols. No request for satellite cross-verification protocols to be mandated. Instead, they doubled down on discipline. Orders were issued. Future multi-vector detections must be escalated without operator discretion. Delays, even for second confirmations, would be treated as violations of duty. Novikov was reassigned to a civilian communications post in Tomsk, his security clearance revoked. His name stricken from operational duty rosters. The message was unmistakable. The radar cannot be questioned. To do so was to question the doctrine. And to question doctrine was to question the party. But beneath the polished silence of official channels, unease spread. If the most sophisticated radar systems in the Soviet arsenal could be deceived by clouds, wind shear, or solar scatter, what else were they getting wrong? The worst part wasn't that radar had failed. It was that the Soviet command refused to admit it had. And in that refusal, the USSR ensured that the next false alarm wouldn't just be a close call. It might be the one no one dares to stop. In the corridors of Soviet defense analysis, a new theory began to circulate, not publicly, not officially, but as a whisper that echoed through secure war rooms and strategy cells. The Americans were spoofing the radars. It was the perfect solution. If the missiles didn't exist, then they must have been made to appear. Electronic warfare, directed energy, a classified CIA or NSA operation. This explanation had everything the Kremlin needed: a clear enemy, a cause rooted in American aggression, and most importantly, a reason not to blame their own system. Military advisors rushed to validate it. Papers were produced citing vague Western patents for signal disruption. Old studies from Project Rainbow and U.S. Navy jamming tests were dusted off and reinterpreted. The theory hardened. The Americans are using space-based deception to probe Soviet readiness. A brilliant fiction, but fiction nonetheless. No independent signal evidence, no interception logs, no electromagnetic anomalies detected by ground receivers, no telltale spectrum bleed, as would occur with active spoofing. And yet, Soviet generals embraced the theory because it allowed them to maintain the illusion that the radar worked, that their empire had not nearly launched nuclear war because of a cloud pattern. By blaming America, they didn't need to recalibrate. They didn't need to overhaul protocols. They didn't need to confront the fact that launch on warning was a suicide pact with uncertainty. It was a comforting lie, wrapped in Cold War logic. But intelligence officers in the GRU weren't convinced. They combed satellite intercepts. They reviewed logs from Cuba, from the Barents Sea, from East Germany. They found no signs of U.S. spoofing ops that matched the dates. One anonymous analyst wrote a single-line summary in a classified internal memo. "We are fighting ghosts of our own imagination." But that memo never reached the upper echelons. It was buried under a stack of counter-espionage reports. Because to admit the truth would be to confess that the real enemy wasn't in orbit or in Langley. It was inside the radar console itself. When the American spoofing narrative began to falter, a second, more insidious theory took hold. If the Phantom missile detections weren't caused by enemy interference, and if Soviet radar systems couldn't be at fault, then the only remaining variable was the operator. The new theory, human error. This version shifted blame away from Moscow, away from the machines, and directly onto the men behind the screens. According to this internal assessment, radar stations like Komsomolsk or Skrunda hadn't been deceived, they had simply been misinterpreted. Operators had panicked. They'd mistaken signal clutter for ballistic arcs. They'd failed to apply proper filtering. They had seen what they expected to see. This theory was seductive. It preserved the integrity of the doctrine. It maintained confidence in the hardware. And most importantly, it protected the chain of command. After all, if the equipment had failed, the party would be responsible. But if a lieutenant had made a bad call, that was correctable, replaceable, punishable. Internal guidelines were updated to increase operator accountability. New psychological screenings were imposed. Training programs emphasized rigid interpretation of signal parameters, not independent judgment. Radar consoles were redesigned to remove certain manual overrides. Trust in the human mind was reduced. Trust in the machine was reaffirmed. But beneath the surface, the contradiction was obvious. If the operators were misreading radar data, why were the detections so geometrically consistent? Why did the same errors occur at different stations, in different months, under different atmospheric conditions? And why did multiple stations report similar phantom returns without any coordination between them? These weren't isolated misjudgments. They were systemic errors, but no one dared say it, because to do so would unravel decades of Soviet investment in its surveillance empire. So the myth persisted. In classified briefings, operators were warned against intuitive hesitation. They were told to follow protocol regardless of doubt, to trust the signal even when it felt wrong. The machine was never wrong, only the man. And in that lie, the Soviet system began to devour itself, a state that demanded obedience over insight, reaction over reason, blind trust over thoughtful pause. In doing so, they guaranteed that the next mistake wouldn't just be misread, it would be executed. And the only defense left wouldn't be doctrine, it would be luck. By the mid-1980s, Soviet intelligence agencies were drowning in data telemetry from radar posts, logs from submarine patrols, intercepts from global listening stations. But buried within those mountains of information was a growing pattern no one wanted to confront. The radar system was seeing missiles that weren't real, and not just once, not twice, but over a dozen times across multiple years and multiple sites. The GRU and KGB both launched quiet inquiries. Analysts in windowless rooms sifted through terabytes of logged radar sweeps, cross-referencing them with satellite telemetry and U.S. media silence. Over and over, The result was the same: no launches, no warheads, no American activity. Only Soviet radar painting phantoms. But when the reports reached higher command, they were either ignored or reframed. No Kremlin official wanted a paper trail proving that their early warning system was deeply compromised. So the intelligence community did what authoritarian systems often do when truth becomes dangerous. They buried it. Requests to increase atmospheric monitoring around radar sites were denied. Funding for multi-sensor fusion programs was quietly cut. A promising cross-verification protocol linking radar data with satellite infrared signatures was canceled before it left the test phase. Inside the KGB's technical division, one colonel submitted a recommendation that every high-priority radar station be paired with independent civilian sensors for audit purposes. He was reassigned within weeks. The fear wasn't sabotage. It was doubt. To admit systemic radar hallucinations would be to admit that the Soviet nuclear command structure based on speed and infallibility was fatally flawed. Worse, American intelligence had already begun to suspect this weakness. Intercepted communications between NORAD and NATO partners showed that U.S. analysts were aware of Soviet radar over-triggering. In one document, a U.S. Air Force colonel paraphrased a CIA briefing. "They're seeing ghosts, and someday they'll fire at them." But the Soviet response wasn't reform, it was retrenchment. Officers were ordered to triple-check human behavior. New loyalty pledges were introduced at radar stations. And above all else, operators were told to trust the machine more than their own eyes. It was a monumental failure of intelligence, not in the sense of missing enemy secrets, but in failing to analyze their own data honestly. They had the evidence. They had the anomalies. They had the right questions. But the answers threatened power. And so, the state chose blindness over clarity, and left the fate of the world in the hands of machines that saw shadows as missiles, and orders that could not be questioned. While the Soviet Radar Command wrestled with illusions and political silence, the United States had been quietly building something else entirely. Not a faster response system, not a bigger radar dome, but a slower, smarter machine. At the heart of America's early warning strategy was redundancy. It began with DSP satellites, infrared eyes in orbit capable of detecting the unique heat signatures of missile launches. But DSP was only the first layer. Every DSP detection required cross-verification from ground-based radar networks like PAVE, PAWS, and BMUs. Seismic sensors that registered the acoustic rumble of silos opening or boosters igniting. Oceanic hydrophones listening for submarine missile tubes firing underwater. Airborne early warning aircraft, AWACS on rotational patrols. And most critically, human judgment at NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command buried inside Cheyenne Mountain. In 1979, a simulated nuclear attack was accidentally fed into NORAD's live network, triggering a false alert that mirrored a real launch. Unlike their Soviet counterparts, American commanders didn't scramble bombers. They didn't prep ICBM silos. They paused. They asked for confirmation. They checked additional channels. They reviewed satellite feeds. And they found the error before the system escalated. Why? Because the American structure wasn't built to trust one signal. It was built to assume the first signal might be wrong. This wasn't a bug, it was doctrine. Where the USSR valued immediacy, the US valued resilience. Where the Soviet response window was minutes, the American timeline had layers of resistance. Launch authority rested not with a machine, not with a bunker crew, but with the president. And the president didn't launch because a radar blinked red. He launched only after redundant systems aligned beyond doubt. This gave the United States something far more dangerous than speed time. Time to think, time to verify, time to hesitate. And in nuclear warfare, hesitation can be survival. American operators were trained not just to interpret data, but to question it, to challenge anomalies, to distrust perfection. Where Soviet doctrine made doubt a liability, American doctrine made it a weapon. The result: when Soviet radar hallucinated hundreds of missiles, their system edged toward retaliation. When American systems were fed a ghost strike, they stood down because their architecture allowed for failure. It was expensive, it was cumbersome, it was slower, but it worked. The American system wasn't designed to believe, it was designed to verify and, in doing so, to save the world from its own imagination. The battle never made headlines. There were no tanks, no treaties, no ceasefire lines drawn on maps. And yet, for the Soviet command, it was among the most devastating confrontations of the Cold War. A battle between their radar and reality. In 1986, another cluster of false alarms erupted, this time from the Olenogorsk radar complex in the Arctic Circle. On 3 separate nights, the system reported small groups of ballistic missiles rising from the Barents Sea. Each time, the launch vector was textbook. Each time, the system raised alerts to launch-ready status. And each time, there was nothing. Once might be atmospheric noise. Twice might be procedural failure. 3 times, that was humiliation. And not just technical humiliation, ideological collapse. The men in charge of Soviet deterrence weren't engineers or radar specialists. They were generals, strategists, and politicians, men who had spent their careers repeating a singular dogma. Our system sees everything. And now, that system was seeing ghosts. Operators whispered about the curse of the red arcs. Officers began to delay reports, waiting for confirmations that, by doctrine, should never be required. Commanders hesitated. And hesitation, in the Soviet nuclear lexicon, was treason adjacent. At one point, a lieutenant at the Skrunda radar post in Latvia was quietly dismissed not for raising a false alarm, but for failing to escalate a suspicious pattern fast enough. He hadn't made a mistake. He had made a judgment, and in a system built on obedience, that was unforgivable. The Soviet High Command tried to conceal the incidents, but leaks reached field units. Morale dropped. Operators became jittery. Some began to secretly cross-reference with Western shortwave radio to see if any real crisis was unfolding. They were using enemy broadcasts to confirm their own system's truth. That was the moment Soviet doctrine died. The battle wasn't about missiles. It was about trust. And the radar, once seen as an oracle of certainty, had become a liar no one dared challenge, and no one could stop believing. No weapon system, no matter how vast, can survive that contradiction. So the USSR did what it had always done in times of quiet disaster. It silenced everyone. Reports were locked away. Commanders were rotated out. Technical flaws were attributed to localized interference. But the ghost missiles never went away. They still appeared from time to time. From still triggered alerts, still forced men to stare at screens, deciding whether to believe the impossible. And each time, they remembered this wasn't war. This was the war that almost was, and the shame of knowing it might have begun because a machine saw shapes in the fog. By the late 1980s, Soviet military planners no longer believed in their own infallibility. They still wore the uniforms, still marched under banners of supremacy, still issued public statements declaring dominance in electronic warfare and early detection. But behind closed doors, a quiet decay had set in. The radar hallucinations these repeated, undeniable failures of their most sacred systems, were no longer technical issues. They were existential crises, because if the radar couldn't be trusted, then launch on warning was suicide. If the doctrine was wrong, then so was every war game, every training simulation, every assumption in their nuclear playbook. And worst of all, they had no alternative. The Soviet Union had built its deterrent strategy like a fortress, tall, thick, and unmoving. But when the radar cracks appeared, There was no way to redesign it without tearing the whole structure down. So they did the only thing a dying doctrine could do. They pretended it wasn't happening. They invested in next-generation radar projects with longer ranges and higher frequencies, ignoring the fact that no upgrade could fix a system that punished human doubt. They pushed the OCO satellite system harder despite its own string of failures, including the infamous 1983 sun reflection false alert that had nearly caused a launch. They trained new operators harder, younger, faster, conditioning them to respond, not to think. The ideology around Soviet defense, the myth of perfect control, was crumbling from within. And it didn't take a Western missile to expose it. Just a stray radar beam and a reflection from the sky. For a system that relied on certainty, the Ghost missiles were fatal. They made doubt unavoidable. And doubt, in the Soviet chain of command, was a virus, one that no amount of doctrine could suppress. In the end, the collapse wasn't marked by one final false alarm, but by a silence, a creeping understanding that the Empire's most trusted weapon, its vision, had lied too many times. And unlike bombs or bullets, those lies couldn't be denied, because every man in every radar room had seen them, and they all knew the truth. If war ever came, it might not be real. And if it wasn't real, but they launched anyway, then the USSR would destroy the world to defend an illusion. Today, the Soviet radar systems that once guarded the skies over Siberia sit silent, abandoned concrete shells, rusted antennas pointing at empty skies. But their legacy remains, not in victories, not in war stories, but in the alarms that never should have sounded. The Cold War nearly ended not in fire, but in confusion, not with an enemy's missile launch, but with a radar beam bouncing off clouds. The most powerful empire in the Eastern Hemisphere, armed with over 35,000 nuclear warheads, stood multiple times on the brink of obliterating the planet, not because of American aggression, but because their machines saw things that weren't there. And no one was allowed to say otherwise. The Ghost missiles that haunted Soviet screens weren't just technical anomalies. They were symbols of a system built on obedience over analysis, doctrine over logic, ideology over reality. They represent the moment when technology outpaced trust, when the very systems designed to prevent nuclear war became its greatest risk. And they remind us of something chilling. In the nuclear age, it doesn't take malice to end the world, it takes silence. It takes faith in the wrong screen. It takes a blink of light mistaken for a missile, and a system that answers without question. Modern systems, American, Russian, Chinese, are smarter now, faster, layered, but they are still made by people. And sometimes people believe what they want to see. So the next time a radar pulses into darkness and returns a ghost, the next time a satellite interprets heat on the horizon, the question won't be whether the enemy has launched. It will be whether someone has the courage to ask, are we sure? Because in 1983 and 1986, and again in 1987, they weren't. And we're still here. Not because the systems worked, but because a few men chose not to believe in ghosts.